what I want us to do today, and we'll I mean, kind of give you the schedule for from now on for the next several months, maybe. For these 5 days here, 5 Thursdays or Wednesday and Thursdays in October, we'll be doing today a brief introduction to the Gospel of Mark. And then the next week, we will do highlights of Mark, uh, the real highlights of the Gospel of Mark. And then the third week, we're going to look at some of the parables in the Gospel of Luke. The more I get into parables, the more I realize that we've just kind of scratched the surface on the parables. And then the following week, the fourth week of our round, we'll do the Bible and mountains, fascinating stories of mountains. And then the last Thursday of the month, we will look at we were saying the non-canonical, two of the books that didn't make it into the New Testament. One of these is called the Gospel of Peter, and the other one is called the Gospel of Thomas. And famous writings, scholars have studied these for a long, long time. But they didn't make it, for all the reasons they didn't make it into the list. Uh, when you look at the list, the 27, you wonder why some of them made it. The little bitty tiny book of Jude, but it's just a good sized couple of 3 paragraphs is in there. Uh, the little bitty 1 page letter of Philemon is in there. Uh, but the bishops on down the line, decided that they were of such value they needed to be in there. And one of the ways that the canon was arrived at, the list was arrived at, was usage. Uh, Sometimes we get the impression, and I'm jumping way ahead here, if you read Luke and Acts, particularly the book of Acts, it looks like it happened just almost overnight. Uh, the way Luke closes out the story of Jesus, as I've said before, and we'll look at it some more. Luke, the Gospel of Luke, has the resurrection, the famous road to Emmaus, the appearance of Jesus to the disciples, and the ascension all in one day. That's the way Luke tells it. Others do it differently, but that's the way that Luke tells it. And then Luke, whoever he was, we don't know who Luke really was. A lot of speculation, but nobody knows. Luke then wrote the book of Acts. He no whoever the guy was wrote both of those, and they know this. The scholars know this from the use of language, the way he writes, and which is way beyond me. I don't have to do that. Don't know how to do it, but the book of Acts, it's supposed to be. We'll get to this. When I was in seminary in the 60s, a couple of really outstanding New Testament scholars wrote, and it was felt, that was taught really, that the book of Acts is a selective, at least selective history of the beginning of the Christian church. And so that's the way I was taught in the 60s. Over the last 35 or 40 years, a whole new approach has been made to the book of Acts that says, and my teachers said the book of Acts was 70 or 80 maybe, but this new whole round of study that's gradually taken hold puts Luke and Acts into the second century to about the 120, 130, somewhere in there. Dating is important because it lets you kind of know what's happening, and gives you a clue why the writing shaped like it did. We all write in context. Context is important. It's very important. Uh, and context without what is another word, it's pretext. So you're always trying to get the context of what is being written. but the way the book of Acts tells it, it like Jesus is crucified. Uh, he wanders this in the spirit. This is the new. This is Act. He comes and goes in the spirit for 40 days, and then he tells some of the disciples to meet him outside Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives, and they have the famous meeting on the Mount of Olives out there. And Jesus kind of gives them their last marching orders, and then he ascends to the Father. This is the ascension of Jesus. And then the way Acts tells it, within just a few days, uh, the followers of Jesus, the followers of Jesus, now Jesus is crucified and come back in them. They are, that's when Pentecost becomes. And Pentecost, as I was taught, is the birthday of the church. Bing, 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 bing. We know now, it's beginning to become increasingly clear that there's a much bigger gap in there between the cross resurrection event when Jesus was about 30, and the next writing that we have is from Paul in about 50. So one way or the other, you got 25 or 30 years in there that a lot of stuff was happening. And what became the church, I call them Jesus groups, or they really, in the vernacular, what we call clubs. You have Rotary, you have Potter, and they had Christian, had Jesus clubs, but that's those. But so the stories, the account in the book of Acts is charming, but probably not historically accurate in every instance. But that's another whole thing that we could do sometime. So it's a very much a process, very much an extraordinary, human evolving kind of process that our ancestors, and they were our Christian ancestors, gradually came to understand that Jesus was somebody extraordinary who deserved their allegiance and commitment. And without, we don't really know how it all happened. It's fun to speculate how all these Jesus groups got started. So, okay, we started there. I'm not following my notes particularly, but anyway, so that's always helpful to me in one of these things to get a timeline, to get some idea of how it flows. We do that all the time when you study any of the big events or whatever it is in our own history. You can't kind of know when they happened and why. So I think it's important to at least to get a broad picture of the initial timeline, knowing that we don't know, knowing that what I'm about to propose here is uh, is the product of centuries of study, but there are no records of all of this. Uh, when you're born, your birth certificate courthouse. They didn't do that in those days. They didn't have that kind of stuff. Uh, so a lot of this stuff is just lost in history. But anyway, a workable timeline uh, that seems to work is uh, Jesus was born in the waning days of King Herod. And we know, scholars know, when King Herod died. He died in about 3 or 4, 6, something like that, BCE. And the way the whole figure comes together, it is very strong scholarship that Jesus was born somewhere in the waning days of Herod, which I say about 4 BCE. So Jesus was born in 4 before he was born, if you do before Christ. So he's born about 4 BCE. And then in ways that we can only speculate, a few years later, maybe he was 15 or 18 or 20 or 25, nobody knows. That's when he launched his ministry in Galilee. Uh, Jesus never went to the big cities. Jesus was a small town guy. And in the New Testament, the Gospels have him spending a lot of time in the small villages, small, typically very poor villages of Galilee. Uh, the book of John has Jesus going to Jerusalem several times, but the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, uh, have him going. Uh, um, Luke has him born in Bethlehem, dedicated in the temple, and then when he's 12, goes back for Passover. You know that story in Luke. But anyway, at any rate, the three gospels, the synoptics as we call them, uh, have Jesus going to Jerusalem only once, maybe twice in his life. Now, he may have gone more than that, but chances are he didn't. It's about 80 or 90 miles from Nazareth, where he grew up, to Jerusalem. And they walked. They didn't have animals. They walked. And travel is always expensive. You had to fly over here and you put a good chunk of money down on an airplane to get, unless you drove your car out, you probably flew over. Uh, so same thing in their day. It was expensive. And it was a 10-day round trip to walk to Jerusalem and back. So even though the book of Luke says the Jews went every year to Passover, that probably couldn't happen. They might have liked to go every year. They simply could not go every year. And when they left, whatever kind of business or work or farm they had took a beating. So anyway, uh, so we're not sure, but Jesus probably began 2025 when he was 20 or 25 years old. By some reckoning, his ministry lasted only about 3 months. If you put some of it together, I sort of think it was about a 4 or 5 year time span in there when Jesus did whatever he did in the little bitty villages of Galilee. Uh, he was speaking the truth to power, which always makes power uncomfortable. Uh, and he Jesus loved the temple and he loved Judaism, but he deplored the way uh, the temple authorities were running the show in his time. They were exploiting the poor people. They were making bad use of the great message of the prophet. So Jesus began to be, while he was working closely with the people, the poor people of Galilee, he was complaining about the way the power people in Jerusalem were abusing them. So, in one way or the other, Jesus began to attract negative attention. It, in study that I've done lately, it comes as a surprise to me that none of the four gospels, nor really Paul, talk about the oppression of the Roman Empire. They were an occupied country from 63 BCE, when Pompey came along, uh, until Jesus' time, and for forever after that. Rome, in various ways, with various rulers, occupied Judea, Palestine, uh, and were very oppressive, very oppressive. They stole the land. They were brutal. Anybody that offended a corporal, what we would say a corporal in the army, that lower rank, could condemn anybody to the cross. Didn't have to have a trial. Didn't have to have anything. You crossed the corporal, and he could get you crucified the next morning. And it happened with far too much regularity. So it was a hard time, really hard time. But the Gospels don't talk about that. Why don't the Gospels talk about that? Probably, I mean, politically, it was not good work to complain about the Romans, even though they were everywhere and they were the dominant force in Jesus' time, and particularly on as the years unfolded. The Gospels do not talk about the Romans, of the oppression of the Romans. Uh, Finally, we know that it was the Romans that crucified Jesus. But anyway, a lot of little pieces in here. Uh, the beautiful stories in Matthew and Luke, for various reasons, have Jesus born in Bethlehem. And we love that story, O Little Town of Bethlehem, and all the Christmas carols. Probably historically, that he was really born in Nazareth. And the way Luke tells the story, Mary and Joseph were from Nazareth, and they had to go to Bethlehem to sign up for taxation. And while there, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. The way the book of Matthew tells the story, Mary and Joseph they were natives of Bethlehem. Jesus was born in Bethlehem. A lot of stuff happened. And then Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus moved to Nazareth. So you pay your money, take your choice. I love the idea of Bethlehem, the manger and the angels and all like that, which is probably a lot more poetry and imagination than history. Gorgeous stories, anyway. So, in fact, during Advent in December, we will look at the birth narratives in Matthew and the birth narrative in Luke. We'll take a chance to look at them and see how they work. The beautiful stories, how they fit together. Probably a lot of poetry in there. So, whatever happened to Jesus, and this is the interesting thing is it is never clear in the New Testament why Jesus was crucified. Uh, did he make the temple authorities mad? Did he get tangled up with the Romans in some kind of way? It is the blips of that, but nobody ever says this is why he died. It's not there. Uh, now the whole now the whole pursuit is uh, what did Paul know and how did Paul do it and so forth. We could talk about that sometime. It is Paul in the 50s or by the 50s who makes it plain that the death of Jesus was a sacrificial death, somehow or another, in the plan of God. Uh, in Mark, we will see, in the other Gospels, we'll see Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist. And I want to say, John the Baptist was a real character. John the Baptist had a birthday. Jesus was undoubtedly baptized in the Jordan River by John. So those are very, very firm facts. I mean, very, very firm allegations that not too many people seriously question. Uh, so Jesus was a Jew. He was either born in Bethlehem or Nazareth. For sure, he spent his years, well, however how long they were, in the little bitty towns of Galilee. Uh, Along the way, he wound up in Jerusalem, got in trouble, and was crucified. Uh, so that those are pretty. I don't have any. There's no need to question those as facts, but as very, very strong allegations about Jesus. So I say, just for my own benefit, that Jesus was born in about 4 BCE. He probably began his ministry when he was about 20, which would be 20 Common Era, and he was crucified in about 30, which, we want to think he was only 30 years old when he died. Uh, and there's a lot of reasons that scholars come up with ideas like that. So Jesus died in about 30. Okay. Uh, Now, all kinds of speculations about what he did and why. Uh, we'll when we look at hit the high points of Mark next week, we'll talk about some of that. Uh, so anyway, that we'll do that. So the next piece on your notes here that I've listed is between Jesus and Mark. If Jesus was crucified in 30, the best estimate is that the Gospel of Mark was written 66, 67, or maybe 70 Common Era, 30, 35 years after the cross resurrection of Jesus. So you got 30 years in there that we know virtually nothing about. There's just no information about that at all. I go back to the way the book of Acts talks about it. It's very compressed, but we know now that much more was happening. One of my favorite scholars is a guy named Dominic Crossan, and I've said this before, he's got a book that thick. It's a gorgeous book on Jesus. And then he's got a book that thick on the birth of Christianity. When Crossan talks about all of the stuff that he and the other scholars are able to extrapolate about what was happening in those 30 years. And I have told you guys before that I'm writing a novel about that. The title of my novel is From Easter to the Ascension, which is a 30, 40 years, and what all was happening, I think, or that I can glean about what was happening in the Jesus movement. Uh, it's always helpful to realize, to kind of internalize how small and spotty and scattered that whole thing was for a long time, at least a couple of 100 years of these little pockets of Jesus groups through through the Roman Empire, through the arc of the Mediterranean, say from Rome all the way around to Egypt, that whole arc, and scattered on out in there, all kinds of Jesus things, Jesus groups were taking place about which we know nothing, or hardly nothing. You have to just extrapolate. Uh, and that's why what they call I tell you about stuff that's fun to listen to, cross-cultural anthropology. Now that's a fun word. But they say if this was happening and this was happening and this was happening, we know this was happening, we know this was happening, we know this was happening. You put all that together and we say that if John was emerging there with all of these pieces that we can know about, we can speculate reasonably well that this is the kind of person that John would have been emerging from that milieu. Okay. So that's how they figured a lot of that stuff out. Um, so along in here, we drop in Paul. We, the earliest note, the earliest firm thing that we have about Paul is, as I've told you guys before, the wonderful little book that we call First Thessalonians. It's one of the Paul's letters. Uh, the scholars give us what they call seven undisputed letters of Paul. Uh, Something like 13 books in the New Testament or have his name ascribed to those books. But there's a lot of debate whether Paul wrote those other books, but there's no serious debate that Paul wrote First Thessalonians, Galatians, Philippians, First and Second Corinthians, Philemon, and Romans. Those are the seven undisputed letters of Paul. The speculation is that he wrote a lot more letters that just disappeared. But anyway, and the scholars are able to date First Thessalonians to about 50 or 55 Common Era. And then the other books that we have followed soon after that. The last book that Paul wrote, he wrote from to Rome, his great treatise that we call Romans, which by any measure is one of the great theological writings of all time. It is a marvelous book that people have studied now for 2,000 years. Um, so, but Paul's the Paul says in his stuff that he never saw Jesus face to face. But what Paul did, he had visions of the risen Christ. Now, we don't put a lot of stock in visions, maybe, but they did. If the person that had the vision was a person of worth and character, whatever, then people would say, okay, Elizabeth really had that vision. And so we listen to what Elizabeth says about that vision. And even though they didn't write it down or anything like that, what she says is credible because Elizabeth is credible. Paul had visions of Jesus, of the risen Jesus. Uh, in the book of Galatians, he talks about it. And then later in the book of Acts, you have the famous story of Paul on the Damascus Road and the vision that he had of Jesus. And that's the story when he falls to the ground, he's blinded, and Jesus is heard. Paul says he heard, or Acts says Paul heard the voice of the risen Jesus. So that's the way we did. And visions were valid. If the person who claimed the vision was credible, then people could buy the vision. And so whatever happened to Paul, Paul was, the story. He was an arch Jewish guy, very conservative, probably a really difficult human being. Uh, got mad at this developing Jesus thing in Jerusalem, and then he had a vision of the risen Christ. Did it happen? How it happened, we're not sure. But whatever it was galvanizing. Something of great moment happened to Paul. Uh, no doubt, something of great moment happened to this man, Paul. And then Paul became persuaded in that vision that the risen Christ this was over a period of time. This was brand new, but for him, Paul became convinced that this risen Christ wanted him to go preach this good news about the risen Jesus to non-Jews, to Jews, but particularly to non-Jews. So Paul becomes the great missionary to the non-Jews. Great story there, fascinating story. So you got Jesus dying in 30, resurrection 30, Paul coming in there, Paul writing in the 50s. Tradition has Paul and Peter being executed in Rome in the 60s, 64, 65. A lot of persecution, apparently. The Jews, the Emperor Claudius, for some reason, nobody ever know why, ordered that all Jews in in Rome, have to leave. So there's a lot of persecution of the Jews in that particular time. And scholars say they think that Paul and Peter were executed in that time. Paul did get to go to Rome, but he went as a prisoner, and that's another whole story. Uh, and but he'd already written his great letter of Romans to this Roman group. How did the Roman group get started? All that fun stuff to kind of speculate. Nobody really knows. So, okay, quickly. Jesus died in 30, cross resurrection 30. Paul writing in the 50s. Mark, we finally get to Mark. Mark is clearly no serious scholar doubt that Mark is the first of the Gospels. And the way the whole thing fits together for Mark, the good evidence is Mark wrote in 65, 68, maybe into the early 70s. The cataclysmic event that happened in the life of Mark, not in Jesus' life, but in the life of Mark, was a group of Galilean zealots, a large number of them, fomented a revolution against the Roman army. And over a period of 2 or 3 years, the Roman army finally prevailed, and that's when Titus and Vespasian, or Vespasian and Titus, went in and utterly destroyed the city of Jerusalem and totally destroyed the magnificent temple that Herod had built. The drama of that would be, suppose that on 9/11, the airplane really had hit either the White House or the Capitol. We would have been even more devastated than with the buildings that were hit, because the temple was the center of life for worldwide Jewry. The Jews for 500 years by then were living all over the Roman world, and for the temple to be destroyed was cataclysmic. Now, so Mark wrote in 65, say 65, before the temple was destroyed, but all this tumult was bubbling, we pretty well clear. The thing to remember is, and this is something that I have picked up lately as I still fool with this. When you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it is important to try to visualize the Jesus that Mark talked about, for instance, and the Jesus of Nazareth. Mark writing 25, 30, 40 years after Jesus was off the scene. Mark might have had some people who knew something more directly about Jesus, but in 30 years in there would have been hardly anybody left that knew anything personally about Jesus. And nobody knows who Mark was or where he wrote from, where he was when he was writing, or to whom he wrote. So the question then becomes, where did Mark get what were Mark's sources about Jesus? We don't know. Could have been people that knew somebody that knew somebody. Uh, you know, part of that mob, but it is mainly the four gospels. It's kind of shocking to some people. The four gospels are basically memories of memories. That nobody was writing this stuff down. Probably the closest friends of Jesus could not read and write anyway. Big debate whether Jesus himself could read and write. I've always felt that he could. He was too smart, and I like Jesus too much to think that he couldn't read and write. But anyway, nobody was writing this stuff down in the life of Jesus. Uh, it took 25 or 30 or 40 years for it began to before it began to kind of come together that Jesus was really this unique Son of God. So anyway, that's another very scholarly kind of thing that's fun to look at. Mark, though, Mark, whoever he was, where he was writing from, to whomever he was writing, wrote, no doubt, what became the first gospel. The chronological order of the gospels ought to be something like Mark, Matthew, John, and then Luke. Mark, Matthew, John, and then Luke, something like that. Whether Matthew, whether it's John or Matthew, anyway, but Mark is the first. The fathers of the church cited at Matthew, and probably they included Matthew because Matthew has the story of Jesus' birth, the first two chapters of Matthew, the story of Jesus' birth. So they put that in there. Then they put Mark. I don't know why they did Mark. Mark is the earliest. Mark is the first. And Mark's gospel is very political in his time. Mark's target, and we'll look at this more closely next week, Mark's target was the temple system. Mark realized that the temple system was exploiting the poor people of Galilee and really exploiting Jews everywhere. By the time Mark wrote, and by that era of Judaism, uh, Jews had come to decide, and the leaders over decades had begun to decide, number one, the way one worshiped God, the way one received repentance or forgiveness from sins was animal sacrifice, not human sacrifice, but animal sacrifice. And the animal could be sacrificed only in the temple in Jerusalem. So that's why worldwide Jews made every effort to go to Jerusalem as often as they could, and particularly for the great celebration of Passover. Uh, so when the temple was destroyed, where do you make sacrifices? You don't make sacrifices anymore. So that's when scholars say that Judaism became the people of the book. The Bible, the Hebrew Bible, really came together in that era after the destruction of the temple. That's all they had left. All they had for centuries, the temple was the center of Jewish life, even though they had a good part of what we think now is the Hebrew Bible. Uh, they they depended more on sacrifice and ritual, and suddenly, with the temple gone, over decades, they had to rethink their religion, and that's what they were doing. So, but in Jesus' time, the temple system with heavy taxation and exploited living on the part of the priest and the high priest and all was was oppressive. Galilean farmers were hardly able to survive, uh, partly because Rome was taking their farms. I've said before, as a Roman, a soldier in a Roman army from wherever he might be from, signed up for 20 years. There were no two terms. You signed up for 20 years. You were in the army, and if you lived the whole 20 years, and it was a big honor to be in the Roman army. Uh, it was a major employer and all. But then, essentially, wherever you were in the Roman Empire, when your 20 years ran out, then the Roman government would give you a farm. And where did the farms come from? They came from the people who'd had those farms for centuries. So, you know, Charlotte here had a farm out from Tucson, and suddenly the governor comes along and says, we got these soldiers we got to take care of. We're taking your farm." And you say, "I've had that farm 200 years." And typically they would say, "Well, show us your deed." And you say, "Deed? I didn't have a deed to that. My great grandgrandpa was buried right there." Too bad they took it. So that was going on everywhere. And then you can imagine how disruptive that was. Suddenly, Charlotte and her family couldn't make a living on the farm anymore. So where'd they go? They went to the cities. And that's when the cities began to get crunched and all riots and everything else. So it was very, very unsettling what was happening there. Uh, so Mark was saying what that we've lost sight of what our religion is really all about. The prophets had a way of saying that God is not Yahweh, is not interested in your sacrifices. He's interested in a pure heart. So, that's what they did. Is our time is gone. We're overtime. There is the monitor. There's the monitor ringing the bell. No, we're not over our time yet. We're going to 2:40. We started. Okay, all right, okay. We're not through yet. We didn't start till 2. Okay, y'all okay? Questions to this point? Okay, I'm telling you a bunch of stuff here, um, and I'm quick to say that in none of what I have said is there unanimity of opinion. Uh, if you've got 3 scholars, you've got 3 different opinions. That's just the way that it is. But what I talk about is one thing, my understanding of what was happening, and a lot of very reputable women and men who deal with this, good women and men. This is kind of the synthesis of what they say. Uh, so, I'm not trying to upset anybody. Uh, so the Gospel of Mark, um, and lately as I said, I have to begin to rethink the way all this happened and to try to understand the two, if you please, the two Jesuses you got here. You have whatever Jesus did and said when he walked around in Galilee. And it looks like, and you read the Gospels, look like that somebody was following him around with a laptop. No, wasn't happening that way. It looks like that almost immediately his close friends knew that he was the once for all Son of God. No, didn't happen like that. That was a growing appreciation, a growing understanding of who Jesus was. And it is a very big theological and biblical question, that whole thing there. Uh, so it was unfolding. It was unfolding. It was not just fixed. Uh, and so Mark had one thing. Every book of the Bible, all 66 books in the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Testament, all of them were written by somebody. Somebody did it in longhand, in Hebrew or Greek or whatever. Uh, all of them had a target audience. So you wrote to somebody, you had a group or some individuals or something in mind when you wrote, uh, and you had an agenda. You had a purpose for writing. Anytime you write a letter to your grandson, you have an agenda. You want to let him know, her know you love him, whatever it is. Why are you spending so much money? Why aren't you going to school? There's a target there. There's you have an agenda, even though it can be a nice, sweet letter, and your loved one knows exactly what Ellen is saying underneath it all down in there. Granny is really loving me or eating my lunch here, something like that. So that's all there. So Mark had an agenda. We don't know who Mark was. We don't know to whom he wrote, but it is clear from his writings that 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 the Jesus that Mark was writing about in 60 was talking about the Jesus in the 20s who was trying to find more humanity in their religious life. He was trying to say to them, you know, I love you people of Galilee, but those guys down there in Jerusalem are selling you a bill of goods. They're taking your money. They're living as kings. They've got all kind of money. They've got all kind of food. They've got all kind of power. And on top of that, they've got the Roman army and Pilate backing them up. Uh, and Jesus wanted to say, we can do better than this. We can do better than this. And and that underlying message that he preached and that people got is and that's at least part of what got him in bad trouble finally in Jerusalem with the temple authorities. In your notes, I've included a powerful passage that you can read later. The religious world into which Jesus was born. And there's a prescient line in there that the rulers in Jerusalem, the temple authorities in Jerusalem, the phrase that I copied from a friend of scholar is called is the guardians of the tradition. The guardians of the tradition. And the guardians of the tradition were guarding it so carefully because the tradition was not from God. The tradition was the source of their power. So they wanted they wanted to preserve not the word of God. They wanted to preserve the tradition that kept them in power, that kept them well fed, kept them in a style of living to which nobody else around them could live. So it's a powerful statement in there, and it's also a commentary of every era of life. Who's exploiting whom and why? Uh, and the dock workers on the East Coast are on strike because they are insisting that the shippers and the owners and all are guarding the tradition that keeps the owners in power. Now, the owners in power are saying, look, you guys are making more money than you ever thought about making. Get over it. Get used to it. So this is the conflict, but it's always that rub of power. Who's got the power? Nobody wants to give it up. Uh, so Mark is challenging, Mark's Jesus is challenging that system of power. And that is the intent of the Gospel of Mark. Uh, when you get to Luke, Luke had another idea, Matthew had another idea, John had another idea, but Mark's, the people that I depend on most favorably, say that Mark's is a political document, attacking a social system extant in Jesus' time that still was extant in Mark's time, but he has this is what his intent is to say that Jesus was willing, maybe reluctantly at first. Who wants to get in trouble? Uh, but that Jesus challenged the political economic system that oppressed most of the people of Judea, Palestine. Uh, so
That was run by the Romans, is that right?
no, the Romans, the ones in power were Jews. The
Yeah.
Romans in power were Jews, but they stayed in power in cooperation, collusion with the Romans.
Yeah.
There was the Roman Empire had one overriding rule, and that is no trouble. No trouble.
Okay.
You begin to get in trouble. You begin to stir up trouble. You begin to take exception. You're going to get squashed. So the temple authorities, with their control, did their very best to keep the Judean Palestine people under control. And they did it religiously, but they did it in collusion with the Romans. And that's why it's very unfair for the Gospels to say that the Jews killed Jesus. And that became the mythology for 2,000 years, that the Jews killed Jesus. In fact, the temple authorities, in collusion for reasons that nobody really knows, executed Jesus like they did hundreds and thousands of other people. So it was so many of third world countries. The president of that country, living like a potentate, stays in power because he has the military backing him up. And the military stays in power because the king or the president, whoever it is cooperating with the military. So you get that collusion there, that symbiotic collusion. Yeah, right. It is. It is. We the book of Ecclesiastes said there's nothing new under the sun, and it's pretty true. It take on a different color. We do it faster. We learn about it quicker, but we humans are pretty much the same. Uh, we we can do very good stuff, and we can do really bad stuff, and we've been in and out of that for the last 15 to 20,000 years at least. It came as a surprise to me a few years ago when I learned from reading that we Homo sapiens, we are the only species left. 400,000 years ago, we had the Neanderthals, we had the Erectus, we had the Australian, all of these different subspecies. They're all gone except us. And for the last 100,000 years, we Homo sapiens, and that's all of us, everywhere we live in the world today, have been in control, which means we're responsible. We can't blame anybody else if the planet blows up but us. So, anyway, that's a rather sobering fact. Uh,
Okay.
so, well, that's enough for us today.